All right, so this should be an exciting talk, or at least exciting to me, all right? Let's get into this. As we do that, take a quick second to kind of introduce myself, and as Murphy Law would have it, I got some technical difficulties, but we will prevail. All right, cool. So I'm Nando. I'm a principal IR consultant with Mandiant, a company of Google now. I got to figure out the right terminology to use when I'm saying that. Nonetheless, I'm retired from the U.S. Army right here locally. I did 20 years. The better half of my career, the latter half rather, was in cybersecurity. The former half was in IT, so no stranger to really technology. Did some time overseas, not really important. I'm also a cybersecurity adjunct professor where I just really am infatuated with education, right? I recall my time really getting started in this. I had no idea what I'm doing. Don't tell anybody, but I still have no idea what I'm doing. But somebody took the time to invest in me, and I try my hardest to really invest in others. There's some PowerShell training platforms, again, all about education. And then there's a number of other places where I have a presence on the web. But enough about that. We're not here to talk about me. We're here to talk about some phishing, right? And let's get into some numbers, right? Some statistics, if you will. And to do this, I'll reference a report from Mandiant, a trusted leader in cybersecurity. But nonetheless, a report called M-Trends, right? It's an annual report produced by the company where we highlight things that we saw within the previous year. If you have not checked it out, I highly recommend you do that. There's some other cybersecurity companies who also produce an annual report. Recommend you check those out as well. But nonetheless, we highlight the top 10 frequently seen techniques, right, that we saw within the previous year. And you see a number of things that are shown there, but really number one, obfuscated files and or information. And that's where phishing really falls into. Phishing isn't new, right? And when we look at the next gen exploit, like I heard somebody talk about earlier today in one of their talks, and not really that being the thing that we need to focus on, well, phishing is one of those things that is like super tried and true, and it just continues to work, all right? So from that perspective, when we look at the top organizations or really industries that are impacted by this, well, the numbers don't lie. And again, this is what we see firsthand. We start to see business and professional services clearly at the top, and then you start to see kind of cascading with the number of other organizations and industries as well. But largely speaking, they're all impacted by phishing. Like there's not one of them that I can say has not been impacted by phishing. And those techniques, they continue to evolve. Some of them have varying levels of success. However, it is still a technique that continues to be used on a daily basis. And it isn't just run-of-the-mill entities that are doing this phishing, you know, the 400-pound person in the basement, as I once heard somebody say. It's APTs, it's fin groups, it's UNCs, uncategorized groups, as Mandiant knows it. It's all facets of industries or malicious actors that are utilizing this, and I keep going back to why, and it's because it's working, right? Does it work 100% of the time? No, but it works enough to where it doesn't deter them. So, cool, it's not new. Is it detected? Yes, it is detected. Varying levels of success associated with that detection. And really just looking at some numbers here, we have essentially our Asia area, we have our Europe area, if you will, and we have the Americas, right? And then we have overall. And we can see from the perspective of intrusions at large, this is encompassing phishing as well, but not specific to just phishing. We start to see the detection based upon internal. We also see it based upon external. And really, from that perspective, you would hope that phishing is largely detected internally, right? Because John Bob gets an email, John Bob says it smells fishy, you know, no pun intended, and he or she reports it. You would hope that it isn't reported externally. Well, I would tell you, my experience shows that it is a subset of both, and in some cases, it certainly is not as quick as it should be. So, what does really phishing give us, right? Well, for an actor, malicious cyber actor, to have some type of action, if you will, in an environment, they need to have initial compromise, initial access, right? So this is kind of what that category in which phishing falls into. We'll come back to this in a minute. We also have things like establishing a foothold in that network, right? So being able to have a presence in that organization's network, even if it is a low-level user that doesn't have any rights. A foothold is a foothold is a foothold. And then at some point, well, that lonely user was good for, the original purpose, but we need to elevate to be able to do what we really need to be able to do and have the ability to likely move in a fashion that we want to move and or do other things. So there's going to be a time in which privilege escalation is going to take place. How that take place, well, that's not for this talk, a number of means. But after that, well, let's spread. I've elevated. Let's see what else is out there. We're going to spread our wings, if you will. It's going to be some form of reconnaissance internally, and then they're going to laterally move. The other thing, this is where we start to lay down an actual true presence. So we got the initial foothold. All right, we're on the system itself. But this is where things like C2 come into play. And you'll note that there is kind of like an arrow, if you will, because it's a continuous thing, right? Kind of rinse and repeat. And then there's going to come a point where they're going to complete the mission. Well, what is the mission? Could be data exfiltration, staging, could be destruction of the machine. Well, that all truly varies. But back to this phishing piece, or really this initial compromise. As we look at the numbers, exploitation is up there, and there's no shortage of that. And we see other things that are being shown, supply chains, stolen credentials, and then we see things like phishing on there. And it's not at the top. And I'm not here to tell you it is the number one thing. It is certainly not. However, it is in the conversation in terms of initial access in most conversations that any of us would have as cybersecurity professionals. And that's because the numbers don't lie, and certainly the data does not lie either. So given that, let's talk about a story, right? This is a use case. Real world. Some things have been, changed to protect the organization, if you will. But this is one example of many that I've dealt with and other of my peers in the organization have dealt with, and we continue to deal with. And I'll talk about at the end here, as of roughly 2 weeks ago, how this is still going on, and it's going to continue to persist as well. So getting into this, I'll paint this situation. We got this guy. He's got the nice comb over. Let me see. All right. And we're going to call him John Doe because it seems fitting. John Doe works for a company we'll call Company A. And there's his email, jdoe@Company A. He also works for a company called Company B. And his username, essentially same thing, jdoe, but that domain Company B, right? So he's got 2 different email accounts for 2 different companies. Where the bad practice starts to come in as we paint this situation is when he needs to interact with other individuals in Company A, you would think that he would utilize his Company A email. And you would think other individuals in that organization would be accustomed to receiving emails from him from his Company A email. That's what we would think. That is not the case, however. He actually utilizes his Company B email to do all this business that concerns Company A. And it had been going on for so long that everybody had become desensitized to that fact that that's what he was doing, and it was the norm. Right? So being that that is the case, anytime they received something from his Company B email, nobody thought anything about it. It was normal in their eyes. Is this on still? We'll be right back, guys. Okay, what about now? I'm back? Okay. If you're watching this 2 weeks from now, I apologize. I didn't say anything important, so don't worry. Yeah, so they're used to this. Nobody thinks anything about it because Homeboy's been doing it for a long time. So painting this story some more, there was a day, early February, this is about 7 months, 8 months, something like that, old at this point. There was a day where Buddy, utilizing his company B address, sent a number of emails to company A. And as we get to the end, we'll talk about why some of this stuff was bad outside of some of the obvious, right? And some of those emails he sent to individuals in company A, well, it was the same email, but he sent it to 180 individual email addresses, and then he sent it to 40 distribution lists. Can anyone guess how many distribution lists were in this organization? Yes, there were 40. So we're talking anything from, IT support with a couple of folks in there to the budget group to organization-wide email addresses, right, or distro lists, right? So cool. They get it. This guy is a very senior person in company A. Nobody thinks anything about it. They open it up, and that's where stuff starts to get really a little bit shady. So what are some of those things? Well, actually, let's talk about the email some. Both company A and company B, they're M365 organizations, two different tenants. So in this case, to bypass email filters in which they had, which were not optimally configured, which is also a different story for later in the talk, he was sending essentially encrypted messages in Outlook or O365 or M365 rather, protected messages. So when received, and you have to forgive all my redaction where I try to go back in and add company A, company B, when received, they see something like this, right? This email you've been sent, it's protected, it's encrypted. You need to be able to open it, and for you to do so, you need to click the read the message button. Normally that photo is there, right, in that red box. And when you do that, you're gonna have an option. You can either A, authenticate to your, utilizing your M365 account for the email that it was sent to, or B, you can request a one-time password. So in this case, most people, all people actually, during the investigation, requested one-time passwords, right? So this is the screen that they would see, nothing really special. They get that one-time password. Again, they're gonna put that in, because at this point, John Bob meant to send this to me, or John Doe rather, right? If it was bad, somebody would have stopped it before it got to me. So since it made it to me, I'm gonna actually do what it needs to do, and I'm gonna open this up. So when they finally decrypt the message, this is what they see, right? And you may or may not be able to see, actually maybe you can, but circled in red there, it talks about this message is being sent from, again, company A, because it contains particularly sensitive information. At this point, most people are curious, but they still think it's for them because, again, this is normal activity in some respect. So for them to access it, they actually need to click in that little window there. Now, it looks interesting because you'll see that in the bottom left-hand corner, there is what appears to be like a Word document. It's a static photo. It's not even tied to the actual message, right? It's more to draw in the person. So they're gonna click on it, and again, still bypassing filters, it takes them here, right? And you may or may not be able to see, but in the URL bar, it says something like Panda doc, right? And then we get a little message in the middle of the screen, and if you can't see that message, actually you probably can, but if you can't, you'll see that that document no longer exists. So, Panda doc, what is Panda doc? Anybody know what Panda doc is? Oh, I'm sorry, let me sweeten the deal. I got a black hat Python book for anybody that knows what Panda doc is. Yes, sir. Close enough. Here, come, actually. I'll leave this over here for you. Good job. All right, so Panda doc, right? It's a site used to create, share, track documents. right? So maybe I wanted to create an invoice. Well, I could use Panda create it and then send it or send a link to them and have them go and sign it. Kind of like what we see in the bottom left-hand corner of those two photos. Or maybe I want to have a form where people are filling out information or whatever the case. Most people, when they think of developing a form, well, they do it in Word and leave it as something that you can change. Okay, that's not y'all, I know. Or you might use something like Adobe or whatever the case. PandaDoc is another method to be able to do that, and it's online, so that way you don't have to download it, send it, all the other good stuff. It's a great platform, right? They do great stuff. But people are loading documents that are laced with other things up there, right? All methods to bypass filters and things that are in place. So cool, now that we've diverted from our originally programmed station, let's go back, right? Because now we see that that email, when decrypted, really is pointed to PandaDoc. That document no longer exists, cool, so what do we do, right? And this is me pretty much throughout the day. Actually, I typically have a pencil in my hand or something and I'm doodling and drawing like ponies and stuff like that, right? Or playing tic-tac-toe by myself. Nonetheless, well, let's look at the data, right? You start looking at other things that we have on, either known systems. There was like 1 or 2 people that self-reported, bless their heart, and then there was other people like, nah, I ain't touch it. And I'm like, it says right here you did. Right? So we start looking at the data, right? And looking at the data, we see that this person, they actually received the email twice. They received it once because they're part of the managers group. They also received it again because they're part of payroll. And looking at the timestamps, they're fairly close to each other, roughly within a minute, all right? Which Homeboy did not try to really stagger it out. He kind of just launched at will. Now, from there, we see a number of things that talk to O365. Well, because this is him interacting with the message, going through that process to be able to decrypt it. But nonetheless, ultimately, we see where the person went to PandaDoc. And when we're following the chain, as we have available evidence, we see shortly after that they're going to a site that's redacted now, but looks kind of weird. Office 365 updatation, right? I tried to look at one of the YouTube videos and make sure I was saying it right because I want to say it right. But nonetheless, it looked weird. So it's like, well, what is this? We'll go check it out, right? And you would guess that by this time, that site no longer, the site existed, however, that page no longer existed, right? All this activity was happening on February 4th, roughly about 2-something local EST, if you will. And then by the time we got involved, it was middle to late February, right? So this piece of the campaign had already subsided and Homeboy had moved on to the next part. Cool, so it doesn't exist. We're a little bit further ahead. We go back to the dry erase board. I finished my game of tic-tac-toe by myself at this point. And then what else can we do? Well, there's this site called URL Scan. Actually, let's go back. Anybody know what URL Scan? Let's sweeten the question here. I got let's see here. I got a smart keylogger by Keycroc. Anybody know what URL Scan is?
Basically, you type in a URL, it scans the website.
Yes. That's for you. Good job. I didn't mean to cut you off. You were absolutely right. I just didn't want you to go in a different direction that would make you absolutely wrong. All right, so cool. So, URL scan. Now, this isn't what, my team and I use as our full source, right? But just like the organizations you work in, there's some things that you use that are publicly available, and then there's some things that are some secret sauce that you use internally, right? So I want to give you the piece that you can use today, not telling you what we use that you can't have access to or you'll never see, right? That doesn't make any sense and it does nothing good for you. So anyway, URL Scan developed 2016. a service certainly that we can scan sites and do some analysis all in an automated fashion. Free in nature, however, there's some restrictions associated with the free version, if you will. There's a commercially available aspect of this as well. It captures things like domains and IPs and the resources. And I think one of the big things that it does that's super helpful for us is it captures a screenshot of that page for us, all right? So the other thing associated with it is if deemed malicious, there'll be a thing up there that says malicious. Now, I'm not going to take that to full heart. However, it could be helpful, but certainly not a smoking gun. So given that, we tried to look at the URL in this platform. And luckily, as luck would have it, somebody had already submitted this URL earlier. Now, earlier in my slides, I think it was somewhere around like 225, right? Which would have been like 725 UTC. That's about the point where those emails started to go out in the organization. Well, almost at 8 o'clock UTC that time, somebody had submitted the URL. The site, or excuse me, the document on PandaDoc was still up, so they were able to get a screenshot of it. All right, so we see the URL associated with the PandaDoc piece with the URI. We also see that timestamp showing when somebody submitted it. And then in the bottom right-hand corner, we see what data, a screenshot of the data that was being housed at that time. Now, mind you, when my team and I go out there, it no longer exists at this moment. However, we know as of roughly 8 o'clock on that day, it still existed, and that's cool. Now, we see this screenshot, and we're like, well, what is that? It obviously looks different than that other image that I showed you, because again, it had nothing to do with it. But when we start to blow that up, we see this, right? You receive 2 documents, really some other data that doesn't really mean anything. But if you're a user, you're like, oh, okay, yeah, it's John Doe sending me a document. We're used to him doing random stuff or whatever. So this is still for us. Now, in the top left-hand corner, there's a piece where the document actually depicts who it was generated by. And if you can't see that, it actually says John Doe because I wrote it, but it says the actual person's name who we're already tracking, if you will. So cool. Now we're a little bit further ahead. We see that the person's using encrypted messages. They're using PandaDocs. From PandaDocs, some way it is making its way to that one site that's redacted, Office 365. So we still have a little bit more to go. Now, looking back at that main PandaDoc piece where we have highlighted up top the URL and the time, there's also a category where it will retrieve the links. So at the time that the page was submitted, roughly about 8 o'clock, and it still existed, the links associated with that PandaDoc document actually went to a site that's also redacted that has essentially almost the same URI, right? Different site, same URI. Or excuse me, the same site that we saw in the logs, right? So cool. We see that how the system got from Office 365, PandaDoc, that 0365 URI, we now can tie how it made it there. Well, somehow, some way in that PandaDoc document, it linked there. We don't have the actual PandaDoc document to be able to fully confirm that analysis. However, at the time of this submission, the link had a link pointed to it. All right, cool. Well, let's go out there. As you recall a couple of slides ago, we did try to go out there and it didn't exist. Now, there's a couple of methods we could utilize to try to see what existed at that time. But for the sake of what we're doing now, we'll say that none of those methods work. So we look at it from another perspective where we're looking at what else was pointed to that one site that no longer existed. Not the PandaDoc site, the other site that no longer existed, the 0365. And then reversing that, we found a different Panda doc link that was pointed to it. And what do we know? It was actually submitted at 9 o'clock on the same day, right? So this guy is very active that day. He's not reusing certain domains and stuff, but his TTPs are not shifting. So now that we kind of figured that out, and guess what? It too has the same document. So he's uploaded 2 different Panda doc documents, and both of them pointed to similar sites, if not the same site. Now, from this perspective, we recognize this guy is still active, even though we're coming in a couple weeks after the fact. And we have yet a different Panda doc link. It cost them nothing, right? They use the free version, they create a document, they lace it, and then they're good to go. If it stays up there an hour and gets 20 people, cool. If it stays longer, cool as well. Now here, right, 9 o'clock, we see the links, and this link that it's actually redirecting to is different from the very first one. But the tactic is still the same, just off of the URI, if you will. But guess what? When we look at that actual site, it was still up. So we're able to see something that we didn't have the ability to see before, what is actually being housed there. And you would guess it's a fake O365 login, right? Now, the other aspect to this is what's behind it looks kind of blurred out, and you may be thinking, or some people thought, well, if I log in, I'll be able to see the real data, right? This is a lot to go through for John Doe, the guy that works at your organization, maybe a little bit senior up, like it's like a chase, if you will. Nonetheless, looking at it, I was very interested in like, well, what is it blurred out? Not like it was really going to show it to me for real, but it's like created tax invoice, no payment schedule. It's like, all right, well, that's kind of interesting. But at this point, it's certainly phishing, right? Panda doc to a random site that was likely compromised, that's now housing this data that's going to harvest and collect credentials. Super interested in the method in which it does. So I go to log in with my email, of course, tomtom@outlook.com. And that's what's happening on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, I fire up burp. We intercept that traffic, and I want to see what's actually being sent. So in doing so, logging in as TomTom, we see the URI, and essentially it's a post request that's being done. And down at the bottom, I see that my creds are being posted to another URI called next.php. We see that at the top, and the one highlighted in red, or circled in red. Okay, so dude's harvesting creds. Okay, got it. Now I'm really interested because we want to know, how does this full thing work? How does this ecosystem of sorts continue? Well, aside from grabbing those creds, he sends it to this next.php. We look at the page source, right? And it's JavaScript in there. So really looking at a couple of things highlighted here, and I can barely see from up here, so let me go over here. The first one, we see that they're returning things like the position of the @sign, and then they're coming through and they're trying to essentially split the domain versus the username, and then coming through and trying to get the actual domain name. And what's interesting here is you got this base 64 piece, right? So decoding that actually decodes to next.php. It's like, oh, okay, well, we already know that's going to be important here in a second. And then, looking at the actual, or noting the actual email supplied by the user and the password associated with it, we then see that the email and the user information is being stored to a new variable. And then, we have some regex here. This is looking for an actual email address, looking in that specific format. And then we're checking to see if anything was received in the actual field. So somebody made it to that front O365 page. Did they actually put any credentials in? From there, trying to check if the credentials that were supplied actually fits the structure of an email, or at least the username. And then lastly, checking to see if a password was input. Now, of this code, it's kind of interesting because what I didn't have highlighted here, and there's another screen with some more stuff, Homeboy is like writing, but he's commenting out code, and then there's a spot in here, or a number of spots where he's got things misspelled. He doesn't care because it works. All right, so from this perspective, same thing where he's doing some slicing associated with the domain. And then what's interesting here, this third one I have highlighted, is no matter what username and password you put in the first time, it's going to error out saying it's incorrect. And then you're gonna, or somebody's natural reaction, somebody's natural reaction is, oh, well, let me put it in again. And after you put it in again, it's gonna error out. But at that point, it's then gonna redirect you to the real logon page. If you put in nando@outlook.com twice, after that, it will then redirect you to the real Outlook page, all right? So he's trying to harvest, he or she is trying to harvest credentials of the same user, either from the perspective to do a confirmation or in case they try to log on with two different accounts. And that's what's happening on this fourth one as well, all right? So, not very, you would think it would be more than this, but I was trying to find the misspelling in there. It's like verify without a Y is one of them that comes up. But, so that's next so that's the main JavaScript. And we note in there that there was base 64 that talked about next.php. Well, here's the next.php for any actor that's out there. You got to secure your infrastructure, right? Like we shouldn't be able to get this far in your stuff. But nonetheless, next.php receives those credentials, and then you'll see that there's an include statement. This is PHP at this point, where it's going to essentially read in, make available email.php, and this is going to be on the server side. Email.php is going to contain the actual email address to send said credentials. The other thing it's going to actually send is not only the credentials, but the IP address associated with the machine in which the user attempted to quote unquote log in, if you will. It then tries to get the geolocation of that, and it utilizes a built-in function of PHP mail, essentially, to then mail those credentials. So I couldn't get to the next piece, the email PHP, or I couldn't get to the point where I could get it in the brief. But nonetheless, looking back and really highlighting this full timeline, right? So encrypted emails are sent, emails are decrypted, PandaDoc URL is visited, whatever site of their choosing that's laced in that PandaDoc document is then having that user redirected to it. The user is inputting their creds, those creds are harvested and sent off. So looking at this, all right, we talk about, and hopefully you went to David's talk earlier, all right, but the pyramid of pain. Changing things like the IP addresses or the websites, the domains essentially in which they're forwarding that information or the PandaDoc document, all that stuff is easy, right? Really what's not changing with Homeboy, and I like to call him Homeboy, is the TTPs. His TTPs remains. And he or she, well, you guessed it, right? They're still doing it today. But at the time, we were able to tie back, and then we stopped at this point because it became not even fun. A number of sites tied to this actor, right? A subset of actors, right? And a lot of it was based upon redirection from PandaDoc, because there's a lot of that going on. But they're utilizing the same URI, and then the identical web page was the same as well. Every now and then we would find small deviations, but ultimately would tie back to what we would assess is the same actor. Here's a number of roughly 12 to 15 sites that were the same at the time, and there's no shortage of them. And really within the last 2 weeks, they're still up to these antics, right? So we see that site there, and this was roughly 2 weeks ago. So this hasn't changed. It's not going to change because it continues to work. We've had conversations with PandaDoc. They're very forthcoming and certainly a great organization. They're working through some things as well, and this is going to continue to be a tactic that's going to be used. So knowing that this is still being used today, what are some things that could have helped, maybe that organization at the time? This is not an all-inclusive list of things to do to, prevent phishing. I'm only speaking to that organization at that time in that space and what we were brought in to really address, right? Education is education is education. That's always going to be number one. However, you might not have noticed in one of the screenshots, they have Proofpoint. That was their email filtering platform. It was implemented in such a way, almost like a firewall that's turned on, but doesn't have any rules applied, right? So if they were being inspected, they might have passed. I have an email filtering platform, but it wasn't actually doing anything. So optimal configuration was needed, validation, and even then, there's some concern that it may not have picked up the first piece, but possibly would have picked up other aspects. While Company B, they're not tied to the investigation that we were brought in to do. That's a different tenant, that's a different organization. So really, how did they get their initial compromise? I don't know, it could be one of a million things. However, be it that is a different tenant, it's an M365 tenant, I would assess that that initial compromise was through that tenant. I'd also assess that it probably was a spray and pray, don't know for real. But things like Azure Active Duty password protection, right? Having things like that enabled. In the organization that we were investigating, they did not have that enabled. If you're not familiar with that, that really starts to prevent the use of weak passwords. Spray and pray could still work, but let's not make it easy where it's like password 123 or like seasons and things of that nature. The organization, as noted, they allowed any and everybody to send emails to their organizational wide distro list from the outside. Should not happen, right? And when we look at it, they were in such a place where there was lots of room for opportunity, right? So as we could see, it's a bad example to be able to do that. Now I get it, maybe individual distro lists with smaller people, but not allowing somebody from the outside to send an email that can reach the whole organization. So certainly recommend against that. MFA, can't say that enough, even though there's certain issues with it. They did not have MFA enabled. And then as we were leaving, recommended that they do MFA, and they were allowing MFA registration from anywhere, right? So we've seen in the past where an actor is already in the network, the organization seeks to enable MFA, and the actor just, registers MFA from their own space or somewhere else out in the world. So you really didn't impact them because they still have access. So when this organization was seeking to enable MFA based upon the recommendation, certainly we want them to enable it and have people register from their own trusted IP space. There's some concerns there, but let's lessen the attack surface associated with it. And given that really brings me to the end of what I have. I'll have this brief up sometime today. If you want to chat, there's my email. I do some coding every now and then. There's my GitHub. And if you want to just connect, there I am. But if there's any questions, I'll take one or two. If not, I'll hang around for a little bit. Yeah, so good question. The question was, did MFA resolve the issue? So we were only focused on the one organization that was receiving the emails, not the organization that was sending them. The MFA piece, although the organization that was receiving it, it wouldn't have made any difference. However, we certainly would recommend it in case somebody did complete the full process of going to that site, supplying their credentials, now allowing a potential actor to get back in that network. We would certainly want to have something in place where MFA would have at least triggered and made it a little bit more difficult. I also note MFA because I feel fairly confident that the organization in which the emails originated from did not have something like that in place. Again, I won't say that's a full, feature that will stop everything, but any little speed bump we can put in place that could potentially illuminate and highlight, malicious activity is great. So hopefully that answers your question. Yes.
When you guys were talking to the affected organization, did you guys see any password reuse, or did you see any use of the John Doe's account on the tenant you investigated for? Because if it's normal for them to always see it out of company B, right, maybe the attacker could have used the correct tenant to actually do some exploitation later on too.
Yeah, so good point. So because he was only using the affected organization's tenant, the one that was impacted, his account had been disabled for some time because of lack of use. And at the time of the investigation, it was still disabled.
So from your experience in cybersecurity analysis field, would you say there is a lot of companies that are still aware of these preventive measures like MFA, like password changing to reduce the likelihood of these phishing attacks?
Yeah, very good question. So, in my day job as an incident responder, I respond to an incident, I tell you what happened, I write a report, and then I move on to the next one. So there's some organizations that literally don't have the right people in place to understand. They're told to go to the cloud because it's cost effective, and as long as it works, they think they're good, right? And then there's other organizations where there's competing requirements, and there's funding or something else that's impeding, or they're going to get to it in the next quarter, right? So there's always a chance that organizations are taken. There's also a group of people who have some technology that could illuminate some of this activity, but they don't have the necessary checks and balances in place to highlight when that technology is no longer in place and working. Case in point, you might have some type of endpoint solution agent that's on all your machines. If that thing stops checking in, not having the ability to identify that it stopped checking in and investigate it is just as bad as essentially it not being there from the very beginning, which we see actors get on there and disable endpoint security solutions all the time. Sir?
What do you think of URL rewriting as far as safe links and stuff like that? Do you guys implement anything like that or recommend anything like that?
I think it depends on the situation. So rewriting to then funnel it through some other platform, I think is certainly useful. In this case, they were like bare bones. They were one of these organizations where they were told to go to the cloud. The cloud admin is like the network admin is somebody else. But yeah, I think certainly URL rewrites the time and the place for it, for sure.
So it's really popular to highlight education as like the #1 fix, user education for phishing. But I've been disagreeing with that with people lately, saying that the more users that you have, the more it costs to educate them, and the more likely it is that at least one of them will make a mistake. It seems to me like you should focus more on a technological solution to solving these problems before education.
That's fair. I could see that approach, almost like a young child, right? Like I could educate them and say, don't touch the stove, but I need to have preventive measures in place to ensure that they don't get to the stove. Problem with that is our technology will have gaps as well, so it's sometimes like the chicken and egg. I certainly agree with that as an approach as well. Maybe both of them are just as equally important. I appreciate that thought. Sir, last one. Yeah, so if I think I understand, we were talking about setting up MFA with geolocation or geofencing to where? Well, I mean, you could do it by IP subnet to say, company trusted space as opposed to it, pushing, or actually don't use push, but retrieving, if you will, from a different IP space. Yeah, there's a couple of things that could be done.
Yeah, I've noticed Duo, like, if I'm logged in somewhere on a device and someone else jumps on there, they can push that Duo, and then I can prove it from that being in the actual network, and it'll let them in.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, and I wouldn't use push, right? I mean, we just seen in the last 2 weeks another example where pushing it could be bad. But yeah, to your point, there's a method to not necessarily say, this location per se, but you can lower it down to IP space that would put it in a otherwise trusted IP space. I would want them in the internal subnet space, and where applicable, if you can see them, that's cool, but in this day and age, that's gonna be much harder. But if they're VPN end to internal space, that's a method as well, yeah. Yeah, good questions. Okay, all right, everybody, thanks for joining, certainly appreciate it.